Welcome to the third part of this heritage talk on uncovering Park Street.
So, to go with a bit more detail now about some of the more intriguing and macabre images relating to Park Street, we have the wonderful Don.
Hello, Don.
I shall now turn off my webcam and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much. Well, as Emma has already said, the use of the Park Street burial ground covered a period of massive population growth, really, where industrial expansion sucked migrant workers into towns such as Birmingham in search of improved circumstances, trying to improve their living conditions and find work. I'm a human osteologist, so I basically study human bone and skeletons, and we're going to look at some of the things that we found at Park Street and some of the interesting skeletons and some of the pathology and also instances of what we call postmortem modification. The influx of people into Birmingham in the late 18th and the early 19th century continued onwards into Victorian times. And what this meant was people would have this transformation from a traditional rural lifestyle, and it would be a sort of cultural and technological shift away from that lifestyle to a more urban life. And this meant changes in working conditions and living conditions, changes in the timetable of life, the day-to-day timetable and everyday activities that would have impacted on the physical and mental health of the migrants in Birmingham. Now, urban life in itself, it brought its own challenges. We have basically a huge dense population, something you wouldn't see in rural settlements. And what this meant was that people were crowding together, and this left them vulnerable to the spread of communicative infectious diseases, things such as influenza and measles and tuberculosis. Generally, the poor in particular crowded into the centre of Birmingham because this is where the work was. And what you found there was basically low standards of housing, inadequate sanitation, poor ventilation, and increasing levels of pollution from, say, steam engines and other industrial processes. This is in contrast to the wealthy inhabitants of Birmingham, who, of course, could afford to move out of the centre into the new suburbs where they could breathe fresher air. Now, when it comes to pathological conditions, we can look at how the lives, the domestic lives and the working lives of the individuals in Birmingham may have been affected by their surroundings, their environment and their circumstances. We know that Birmingham obviously was renowned for its industrial manufacture, in particular metalwork. So anything ranging from toys to guns to jewellery. Birmingham still has a large jewellery quarter today. They're also world famous for the production of buttons, and we found several old buttons during the excavations at Park Street, including button wasters from where they manufactured the buttons from the shells. This kind of work was really very intensive, very repetitive, and often very highly skilled. It entailed long hours of working in little workshops for which Birmingham was famous. And it meant that more and more people spent more and more time indoors. And a lack of exposure to sunlight hinders the metabolism of your vitamin D. And what this means is that you start to suffer from vitamin D deficiency. And actually, we see examples of this in Park Street, in the burials, particularly in the poorer northern area of the ground. And what we see in particular is childhood rickets. Now, childhood rickets is where there's not enough vitamin D to properly mineralize the bones. The bones need to be tough because they're a protective skeleton for the body, but there's not enough vitamin D to properly mineralize the bones themselves, and this means that they're a bit soft and they can bow or bend under the weight of the body. And the bones that take most of the weight of the body, of course, are the legs. So we tend to see this bowing and bending of the thigh bone, the femur, and the lower leg bones, the tibia and the fibula. And this is showing that these individuals were suffering from vitamin D deficiency. And it didn't just cause bowed legs. I mean, it was important for numerous parts of the body, including things such as keeping a good level of immunity, keeping your immune system healthy so you could resist infectious diseases. So this had severe consequences for the individuals at Park Street. We also see evidence of vitamin D deficiency in adult skeletons, and this is known as osteomalacia. And this could also cause bending or curvature of the long bones. But we also see examples of where the poor bone strength has weakened the thinner bones of the skeleton, such as the scapula. And this can lead to small, what we call microfractures. And these result from very minor trauma that can still cause these little cracks and fractures to these thin bones. And we can also see the difficulty that these little fractures have had in trying to close up and heal. And again, this is related to the vitamin D deficiency. There's not enough vitamin D to mineralize and to close that wound. So we get these types of fractures in these thin bones. And rickets became a real problem from the 18th, 19th century. As people crowded into towns, they were all in an area of dense occupation with reduced sunlight, increased pollution. They weren't getting enough vitamin D, spent too long indoors. And really, it got worse and worse throughout the 19th century. And although things improved in the 20th century, vitamin D deficiency is on the increase again because of our sedentary lifestyle and the fact that we're spending more and more time indoors on our computers. So sometimes these diseases do come back to haunt us. One other thing just to point out on this slide is you'll have a picture of a rib. Now, this relates to lower respiratory disease, and this is something that we've also found in the north area at Park Street. What this is new bone growth on the inside of the rib cage, and this is caused by inflammation of the pleura that surrounds the lungs. The lungs have been irritated by possibly pollutant particles that have got down into them from the industry, or perhaps we know that sometimes these lesions can be caused by specific infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. And tuberculosis in particular was rife in English towns at this time. It was endemic, and it was a major killer. So again, this is telling us about the health of the urban population of Birmingham in the 19th century. Now, if we look at the next slide, this is interesting to see because we often talk about the working conditions and the domestic conditions causing ill health in past populations. But we forget sometimes that habitual activities and habits and customs can also affect your health, and none more so perhaps than smoking, and in this case, pipe smoking. And luckily enough, in archaeological remains, it can be quite easy to distinguish individuals who have been smoking a pipe in the 19th century in particular, because labourers often tended to smoke short pipes, which they could clench between their teeth all day long while they carried out their jobs or activities. And this would leave huge gaps in the dentition, as you can probably see. In some cases also, we get to see the results of the burning of tobacco. In the case of this individual, where we have the teeth, on the inside of the dentition, we see these brown marks, which are tar stains from the burning of the tobacco. We also tend to notice that individuals who have these signs of pipe smoking also have more rib lesions. And of course, this just tells us what we already know to an extent, in that smoking is bad for your health. So this is another way that we can look at the health of the people who were buried at Park Street. Now, something that we'll see in the next slide, we call it postmortem modification. This is where something has been done to the skeleton following the death of the individual. And with the medical advances of the 18th and 19th centuries, we start to see more and more examples of autopsy in burial grounds. Now, autopsy is the medical investigation of the body after death in order to determine the cause of death. It's a fairly standard procedure that hasn't changed much over the years, and it's fairly easy to recognize in archaeological remains. That is because as part of this process, the pathologist often needs to inspect the vital organs. And this will involve, for example, having to get access to the brain. In order to do this, they have to saw around the skull and take off the top, take the skull cap off basically, to inspect the brain of the individual to see if there's anything wrong with it. And this is fairly obvious in archaeological remains. As you can probably see, we've got a big saw mark through the top of the skull. More subtle changes might involve small cuts to the front of the chest, in particular to bones such as the ribs, the clavicles, and the sternum. Now, this represents the pathologist opening up the front of the rib cage, which they would then remove, and this would allow them to examine the internal organs of the chest, such as the heart and the lungs. Now, as I say, this was becoming a more and more common procedure in the 19th century, and we had about 150 cases of autopsy from Park Street out of the 4,000 burials studied so far. So we expected to find cases of autopsy. However, one thing we didn't expect to find, we're going to see in the next slide, and this is anatomical dissection.
And can I
Now,
just ask, Don, before we move on,
sure.
this line here, I can just pick out another line below the craniotomy line. What would that be?
Yes, Natasha, that's quite a good spot, actually. That's a very interesting point because, as I say, we have to have 150 examples of these craniotomies at Park Street, and they're not all the same. They can vary quite a lot. Sometimes we have very clean single saw marks going through the cranium at a regular height, very neatly done, real professional job. On other occasions, we have craniotomies that are quite wonky, quite uneven. They might be higher on the right side than on the left side. It's almost as though someone is practicing or being taught the process. And of course, at medical schools, you'd have trainee doctors who would have to learn how to do this. And it would take a while to get the technique. And this particular extra mark that we see on the cranium in this case is what we call a false start. And anyone who's sawn a bit of wood, trying to, they want to saw a wood in a particular place, will know what this feels like. You're trying to saw through a plank or something, and you get the wrong part, and you have to take the saw out and then stick it back in and try and get it in the right place and continue. So basically, that's what's going on here. They started and they've gone, oh no, I've just started a bit low. I don't want to go that low. I don't need to go that low. I want to shift it up a bit and saw through the cranium. So that explains that, I think.
Thank you for watching part 3 of this heritage talk on uncovering Park Street.